Okay, this morning I want to talk about creativity and how one can develop your own creativity. Now, to do that, I want to talk about, first of all, the creative process, which is going to deal with 5 different steps. And I also want to talk about an interplay between one's imagination and understanding, and how eventually this leads to different forms of creative self-expression, or how you develop yourself creatively. Now, the creative process. Step number 1, preparation. Step number 2, incubation. Step number 3, the flash of insight, which has also been referred to as the eureka moment. Step number 4, evaluation. And last but not least, step number 5, manifestation. Preparation. Now, what this basically ends up meaning is that you have to come to learn the rules of the game. It seems that any field that you eventually want to make a creative contribution within, there is a certain amount of information that goes along with it. Whether you want to make a creative contribution in literature or artistry of some variety, being a potter, or painter, musician. If you want to be a physicist, or a doctor, or an engineer, or a mechanic, if you want to make a creative contribution in any of these fields, you kind of have to understand what came before it. I don't think that you're going to be able to make a creative contribution within the scientific community if you don't have somewhat of an understanding of the different theories and models and interpretations that have been a part of the scientific community. And the same thing applies to whether you're a mechanic. If you don't understand how engines work or how the exhaust system operates or whatever the case may end up being there, if you don't have the information that's been accumulated for, in some situations, hundreds of years, if you don't look into it, it's unlikely that you'll end up making a contribution within that field. I don't think that you're going to discover some clever solution in theoretical physics without understanding the equations of Newton, or Einstein's general and special relativity, or the different equations within quantum mechanics. Or you're not going to make a massive contribution within biology if you have no idea what cells are, or how certain chemical absorptions occur within certain locations of the body, or how the various cells work together harmoniously to form certain tissues, and how they function as a group. If you don't have a bit of an understanding of what's going on within a specific field, highly doubt you're going to make any sort of contribution within it. So next we have the period of incubation. Now, it may seem a little counterintuitive to actually step back from whatever problem you're pursuing. Say, for example, you're a doctor, and you have a patient that ended up coming in with a high fever, and you're just considering multiple scenarios that ended up leading to this particular ailment. And you've been thinking about it and thinking about it and thinking about it, and eventually you end up getting to the point where you just need to take a bit of a breather. So you go for a walk, or go ride a bike, whatever. But you end up stepping back from the problem. And as your mind settles down, or calms down, and you're not completely engaging it as you were before, what ends up happening is that a lot of these ideas are given the opportunity to mix around under the threshold of consciousness. And this is where your peculiar or unusual types of connections end up resulting. It's almost like the information is being subconsciously synergized into something new. And this ends up allowing you to have almost a non-linear way of gathering insights, where you can jump across categories of thought in like a single bound, where you cross-fertilize perspectives or models or insights that you ended up acquiring during the process of preparation. Your preparation is almost like setting up a lightning rod for a certain idea or insight. And as you end up stepping back from the problem, it's almost like a thunder cloud ends up looming overhead, and all of a sudden the lightning rod gets struck by lightning, which is the idea. which is the eureka moment, the moment of being like, aha, I found the solution to my problem. And that's step number 3. So it's actually acquiring the insight into something that you were immersed within. So you end up going to the next step. Okay, evaluation. You have to see whether or not this idea is something worth pursuing. I mean, there seems to be a lot of ideas that are relatively mediocre, or they don't end up lending themselves to any sort of practical application, or there's no way that you can go about testing the theory, or writing about it, or painting it, or the amount of time it would take to check something in your car that you thought that may have been wrong, may be not worth the effort. Whatever. So you have to consider whether or not you want to pursue that idea or not. When you think about the creative prodigies, or the ones that are the higher echelons of creativity within our culture, it seems that a lot of them have a great ability to decipher whether or not they want to pursue something or not. And anything that's remotely insufficient or doesn't have the weight that it should, they drop it without hesitation. There's almost a ruthless attitude when it comes to getting rid of mediocre ideas. So you have to see whether or not you want to pursue the idea, which ends up going to the final step, which is manifestation. Eventually testing your theory, painting your picture, writing a certain passage, changing the part within the car, or whatever endeavor that you were trying to have a creative discovery within. You have to go and test it. You have to go put it to work. I believe Edison was the one that ended up saying, and by the way, I'm not even certain as to whether it was Edison. You might have to double check the facts on that one, but this is that 99% perspiration and 1% inspiration. So again, those 5 steps in summation are preparation, learning the information that's a part of a field that you want to have a creative insight within. Number 2, incubation. Stepping back from the problem, allowing your subconscious to synergize these ideas in unusual combinations. Number 3, the flash of insight, where all of a sudden, once that synergetic effect occurs, it manifests, and then voila, an idea pops in your mind. Number 4, seeing as to whether or not you want to pursue that idea. And number 5, actually attempting to manifest it, to put it to the test, get to work on it. So again, that's the 5 different steps of the creative process. Now, I want to briefly talk about another system of understanding creativity, and that's that it's an interaction or an interplay between your imagination and your understanding. So, to make this point a little more concrete, I'm going to use the guitar, as I have been, because I really do like that example. But I'm going to use that as a way of describing how this idea ends up working. And again, if you want to apply this to anything that you want, any instrument, or any type of artistry, or any type of occupation, there is so many different examples that you can end up using for this type of dynamic. You can apply it to anything, but since guitar is something that I'm familiar with, I should say, I'm going to just use that instead of bumbling around with something I'm not all that familiar with. So anyways, so guitar. Now let's just say that you pick up the instrument for the very first moment, and you want to express yourself creatively on this instrument. The thing is, you first of all have to understand what the heck you're doing. It's the same starting point as I mentioned in the first one, where you have to start preparing. So you start learning music theory, start seeing the 12 different notes that you divide all these vibrations into and how these notes relate to each other. And you start learning things that are a part of the guitar, like chord diagrams and scale diagrams and tablature and all of these different theories and ideas and techniques that you eventually end up acquiring. So the thing is, let's just use one specific insight, one type of understanding. Let's just say you learn how to play a G chord. So it took you a little while to figure out where your fingers need to end up being on the instrument. And during this time, you're not really being all that creative because you're focusing on understanding what needs to be done. And as a result, there's not a lot of creativity that's occurring because the bulk of your energy is just towards understanding what you need to be doing. But let's say that you do finally get to the point where you understand what you need to do. You get your fingers in a certain location, and now you strum it out, and then voila, now you see the results of your action. Now I think that it ends up moving towards your imagination once your understanding is firmly intact. So now you start strumming out the chord. You start applying different rhythmic patterns to it. Maybe you end up plucking out the individual strings and create arpeggios. But again, you end up expressing yourself through your understanding. And that's what you're doing with your imagination. Your imagination is just taking what you've understood and then recombining it to different ways, to novel ways, to ways that were unfamiliar to you before. But it's still grounded in reality. It's still grounded in your way of understanding the instrument. So during that time that you're expressing yourself creatively through that understanding, your understanding is actually being neglected. And now eventually, let's just say you get overly familiar with this chord. You've played it 1,000,000 times. You know exactly what it sounds like and plucking out the individual strings and how they sound like, and you eventually become bored with it. Now you end up moving back towards your understanding, where you end up gaining more insights, more ideas, more ways in which you can express yourself through the instrument. And again, during that time, the imagination is neglected. Once you understand the concept, you go back to the imagination, you express yourself with that concept, and eventually you're creative once again. But again, creativity and the development of creativity is moving back and forth in between your understanding and your imagination. Learning the concepts and then applying the concepts in new and novel sort of ways. But there's one thing I want to briefly add, just to put the point home, I suppose, and that is how you end up viewing the creative process, or your own intelligence, I should say. And there's two different ways of viewing this. So there's some people who think that intelligence and creativity is something fixed and stable and something that you were born with. It's an innate quality. Whereas there's others that end up treating intelligence and creativity as something malleable, something fluid, something changeable. Now the first view, by thinking that creativity is just something that you have, you were born with it. Maybe you might think of people like Mozart as just, they have the genes for creativity, and I wasn't born with those, and therefore I can't be very creative. Or if you end up thinking that you are an incredibly gifted, intelligent, creative individual, and you were born that way. This is a quality that you were given. Now, these people usually have a high desire to prove themselves. They want to be seen as smart, and they avoid looking unintelligent at every possible opportunity. Because again, they've developed an image of themselves as an intelligent person, so they're afraid of taking risks. They don't want to put themselves on the line, because again, if they end up failing, it would go against this image of themselves, which is very disconcerting and could be rather uncomfortable. They want to feel safe that they're an intelligent person. So again, they have a less of a tendency to try to refine their skills, to develop to that next point. Whereas if you end up viewing creativity and intelligence and your ability as something malleable, as something changeable and fluid, then you can get fully involved within the learning process. And by not being worried about the outcomes of your actions, you can end up doing more and end up testing yourself more and challenging yourself more. And it's kind of like the old saying that a sturdy ship can go farther from port. You're a sturdy ship. You're confident about the process, and you immerse yourself in the process. And as a result of that, you have a greater tendency to end up becoming more and more refined within your creativity. Because I think that creativity, like intelligence and like your ability, is something that can be grown, like a muscle. And it may be exhausting at first, but through constant application and constant refinement and constant use, it eventually gets more and more strong or more powerful as time goes along there. So again, that's sort of my idea of creativity and the creative process. It is something that you eventually can end up getting better at through time. And I think viewing it through the attitude that it is malleable, that it is fluid and something changeable, and it's not an innate quality that some people have and some people don't. But again, I think by becoming familiar with how the creative process works, you will give yourself an advantage for becoming a more creative person.